Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the Hellboy movies. Now, as the title states, this is just part one of my Hellboy retrospective. Here we are looking at the live-action movies. The Hellboy from 2004, its sequel, The Golden Army, and the 2019 Reboot. Part 2 will be coming sometime in the future, and that will look at the animated movies Sword of Storms and Blood and Iron. Now, this is going to be the same as my other retrospectives, where I'll look at the creative team before diving into the characters and plot of each movie. I'll also look at the reception that each of these movies received. That's critic scores, audience scores, box office totals, so on and so forth. I will then discuss the Road to Hellboy 3, chronicling what happened with that project and why it's not, and what led it to not being made before getting to the 2019 reboot. Now, as always, if you want the PDFs of my presentation files for this episode, head over to the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com, and find the corresponding blog post. There will be a PDF download link. So without further delay, let's tear right into Hellboy. Now, before we get into the Hellboy movies, let's actually discuss the comic book origins of Hellboy. So, Hellboy was created by Mike Mignola, and he first appeared in the San Diego Comic-Con comics. Specifically, he appeared in issue number 2, published in August of 1993. Now, Hellboy originated by Mike Mignola doing a drawing of a demon with the name Hellboy written on his belt at a comic convention, and Mignola initially didn't want anything to do with the concept, but he just liked the name. He did later want to do a creator-owned comic, basically an independent print, instead of just doing other people's characters. Now, before Hellboy was published by Dark Horse, an independent publisher back in the early 90s, it was pitched to DC Comics, and DC Comics actually loved it at the time, but the board of directors didn't like the idea of it involving Hell. So now let's go into the creative team for at least the first two movies. Now, the first two movies were directed by Guillermo del Toro, who also wrote the screenplays for both of them. And Guillermo del Toro, as a director, is probably known for Cronos, The Devil's Backbone, Blade 2, Pan's Labyrinth, Pacific Rim, and the Best Picture winner of the 90th Academy Awards, The Shape of Water. Now, as a writer, he's credited for Cronos, The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, The Hobbit trilogy, Pacific Rim, The Shape of Water, and he also created the FX series The Strain. And Peter Briggs co-wrote the screen story with Guillermo del Toro for the first movie, and the only thing that he really wrote after this was one episode of the Thunderbirds Are Go TV series. It was a cartoon back in the 2000s. And Mike Mignola came in and co-wrote the screen story for the second movie with del Toro. Now, Mike Mignola obviously being the creator of the Hellboy comic book series, as I just stated a minute ago. And for DC fans, he wrote the graphic novel Gotham by Gaslight, which did get turned into an animated movie back in 2018 called Batman Gotham by Gaslight. Now let's dive into the 2004 Hellboy movie, starting off with the characters, and we gotta start off with Ron Perlman as Hellboy. Now, I actually think that this was a good casting choice just because of Ron Perlman. Ron Perlman is able to disappear into any character that he's playing, really outside of Sons of Anarchy. But many people forget that he did play a beastly character in the Beauty and the Beast TV series from the mid to late 80s. And we do get a dynamic character out of him because not only is he a demon fighting other demons, there's also a human element thrown in when Liz gets introduced. And speaking of Liz, we got Selma Blair as Liz Sherman, a pyrokinetic who leaves the BPRD, that is the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense, to learn how to control her impulses by staying in a mental institution. Now, she does become a love interest for Hellboy in the movie and in its sequel. Then we have Doug Jones as Abe Sapien, who is a water creature that handles all of the research and how to kill the various demons when out in the field. Now, most people might know Doug Jones from Star Trek Discovery as Saru, and he was also the Silver Surfer in Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer. He was the man in the suit, but not the voice. Then we get to John Hurt as Professor Broom. He's more the father figure to Hellboy and the founder of the BPRD in this movie. Rupert Evans as John Myers. He is the agent that was fresh out of Quantico. He was there initially to help Hellboy while living in the BPRD, but later becomes an adversary in terms of the love subplot between him, Hellboy, and Liz. Then we get Jeffrey Tambor as Tom Manning, who is the head of the BPRD, and he's only really active in the field at the very end of this movie, and most of you out there might know Jeffrey Tambor from the show Arrested Development. Next in the movies, we have Karel Roden as Grigory Rasputin. Now, this is the main villain for Hellboy in this movie. He's trying to bring about the end of the world via apocalypse at the hands of Hellboy. Now, this character is inspired by the real-life Grigory Rasputin. And for those who don't know, Rasputin was a mystic and self-proclaimed holy man who aided the Romanovs in the late Imperial Russia. So, to keep a long story short, Tsar Nicholas II in 1915 left Petersburg to oversee the Russian armies during World War I, and as Russia was seeing defeat, he was assassinated by a group of conservative noblemen due to his influence over Imperial Russia. He was shot 3 times, allegedly ingested enough poison to kill a horse, and was drowned. The autopsy found no poison in his system or water in his lungs. The only thing that was certain was that he was shot 3 times. Now, a popular conspiracy theory is that Rasputin was killed by the British Secret Intelligence Service that's known today as MI6. According to the theory, Rasputin was trying to urge Tsar Nicholas II to strike a peace deal with Germany, and that would ensure that Germany could concentrate its military efforts on the Western Front at the time. So, to close this off, I believe that this version of Rasputin in the movie is the version that worked with Tsar Nicholas II to strike the peace deal with Germany, because Rasputin is working with the Germans during the Second World War. Then we have Bridget Hudson as Ilsa Hopstein, and she's basically just Rasputin's love interest, and that's all she is. And finally, we're going to end this off with Ladislav Bernin as Karl Rupert Cronin. He was Hitler's top assassin, according to Professor Broom in the very beginning of the movie. He wears a gas mask and a protective bodysuit. Now, in the comics, he was a top scientist, but is hiding underneath the gas mask and bodysuit because of a disfigurement. And the first time we saw the man under the mask was actually this movie, and his biography was massively expanded for this. And the portrayal of the character is vastly different from the comics. In the comics, he's more the type of character that would say, in Del Toro's words, "Arg, don't break the machine!" Here, he's a soldier that's really just loyal to Rasputin. Now let's dive into the narrative of the 2004 movie, and to start things off, this movie was loosely based on Hellboy Seed of Destruction that was published between March and June of 1994. Yes, it was a miniseries, but it should also be noted that this would be the first storyline in the Hellboy comic book series. Now, the movie opens up with Hellboy's origin story. Basically, it starts in 1944 in Scotland when the Nazis used Rasputin to access the paranormal side to enhance their chances of winning the war. This is where we see Professor Broom for the first time, along with the primary villains throughout the movie, Rasputin, Ilsa, and Cronin. Now, the portal on the other side remains open long enough for a baby Hellboy to come through. Professor Broom takes to him, and then it cuts to the BPRD in quote-unquote modern day being 2004. Now, this movie is based around black magic and the occult, and we see this right after the opening credits where Ilsa and Cronin resurrect Rasputin with a Sherpa's blood. So we then get introduced to the character of John Myers. Now, this is primarily used for exposition to get to know the history of the BPRD, as well as introduce the characters of Hellboy as an adult, and explain that he ages in quote-unquote reverse dog years. So even though he was a baby in 1944, in 2004 he's only 20, as well as introduce Abe Sapien. We then cut to a museum in New York to see a day in the life of the BPRD. Hellboy is shown as this lone wolf type, and that's the way he always prefers it. Abe Sapien stays on the outside and is the primary researcher. He brings along older books that will tell Hellboy how to kill the creature that he's facing. This sequence holds the first puzzle piece that leads to the final conflict with Rasputin. Ilsa and Cronin go to the museum to obtain a scroll from the 15th or 16th century that'll help Rasputin later in the movie. Then we get introduced to Liz Sherman. Now, she's staying at the mental hospital to learn how to control her power, and this is where the love story between her and Hellboy is introduced. Later, Rasputin activates her power, and she basically burns the entire place to the ground, kills everybody, so she's forced to go back to the BPRD, and that leads her to falling in love with John Myers, and this creates that love triangle between Liz, John, and Hellboy. And now that does lead to some great comedy in this movie. Now, during this whole sequence with the love triangle, Broom gets killed and he's being used as the last piece of the puzzle to lead Hellboy into Moscow to take on Rasputin. Now, while in Moscow, we see that Hellboy used black magic to bring a corpse back to life to lead him through the tunnels to get to Rasputin. It's later revealed that Rasputin wants to bring about the apocalypse, and if he doesn't accomplish it, then it is Hellboy's destiny to bring it about anyway. Rasputin kills Liz Sherman to get Hellboy to use his rock hand as the key to bring about the apocalypse. He doesn't go through with it, and it leads to Rasputin and Ilsa getting pulled into the portal instead. Then Hellboy brings Liz back to life by using what I assume to be black magic, because it is shown that he knows it. After all, he brought a corpse back to life once, he can probably do it again. And now, I would just like to apologize for rushing through this narrative section, but black magic and the occult as a subject matter just doesn't really interest me, unless if it's used in more of a mystery story, like the first Sherlock Holmes movie from 2009. Now, I understand that that's what the early Hellboy comics were. They were heavily focused on the occult. So this movie's narrative just wasn't my cup of tea. What held this movie together for me was simply just the cast and the cast alone. So how was Hellboy 2004 received? Well, Hellboy was a hit with critics, scoring an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes out of 201 critics and a 66% audience score out of 458,921 audience members. And it has a Metacritic score of 72 out of 37 reviews and a user score of 8.5 out of 10 out of 587 ratings. On IMDb, it has a score of 6.8 out of 10 out of 299,439 reviews. Now, the movie was made on a $66 million budget and grossed $99,378,985 back in 2004. So in 2020 dollars, that is the equivalent of $135,792,518. It's safe to say that this movie was a hit with critics and audiences at the time, but it wasn't a financial hit. However, that did not stop Revolution Studios from ordering a sequel. Now let's move on to Hellboy II: The Golden Army, and for this character section, I'm going to start off with the returning characters. So Ron Perlman is Hellboy. Now this movie expands more on the love story between him and Liz Sherman. Otherwise, he's the same character as in the prior movie, which is okay since this series was intended to be a trilogy. And then Selma Blair does come back as Liz Sherman, and in this movie, she's pregnant, and it's revealed at the end that she's carrying twins. Doug Jones is Abe Sapien. In this movie, we really see more of his romantic side with Princess Nuala gets introduced. Otherwise, he's the same researcher that we saw in the first movie. Jeffrey Tambor is Tom Manning, still the head of the BPRD, and he's working more directly with the team since Broom is no longer alive by this point. Now, John Hurt does come back as Professor Broom, but it's only in the very beginning, and it's as a flashback to Hellboy as a young child back in 1955, just to read him the story of the Golden Army. Now let's talk the new characters. So we have John Alexander as Johann Kraus. Now, this character comes in and acts more as a babysitter to Hellboy since John Myers is no longer there. Initially, you believe that he's a robot, but he's actually a spirit that can inhabit any solid object. Now, John Alexander is the man in the suit, but Johann is voiced by Seth MacFarlane, creator of Family Guy, also voice of Peter Griffin, creator of American Dad. He also voiced Stan Smith. The Cleveland Show, he voiced Tim the Bear, and also created The Orville, where he plays the captain on that show. Next, we have Luke Goss as Prince Nuada. He's our primary villain of the movie, and in this movie, Prince Nuada is the elf prince that comes out of exile to wage war against the humans. Essentially, he's the Machiavelli character. And then we have Anna Walden as Princess Nuala. She's the twin sister of Prince Nuada. Any pain that one feels, the other feels. And she is withholding the last piece of the crown that Prince Nuada needs to command the Golden Army, and comes across the BPRD for help. Now let's get into Hellboy II: The Golden Army's narrative. Now, this movie was an original story not based on any of the comics. However, it was based on the tone that the comics were shifting toward at the time. The Hellboy comics were going down more of the mythological route rather than the occult route that it started as. Now, in this story, there's a legend of a golden army that was created by the elves to wipe out the humans during a war with both sides. The elves controlled this golden army that was all machinery and just slaughtered the humans with absolute no remorse. And at the end of it all, the Elf King decided to make peace with the human race by breaking up the golden crown that was used to control the golden army. He gave one piece to the humans, and the elves kept the other two. Now, the elf prince Nuada went into exile until he felt that his people needed him. So in the very beginning of this movie, Prince Nuada comes out of exile to recover the crown pieces, and he recovers the piece that was given to the humans, and then he goes to see his father to get the other two. Prince Nuada kills his father and recovers his piece, but his sister, Princess Nuala, escapes with the final piece that is needed. The BPRD is working to keep Hellboy a secret in this movie, but they are finding it more difficult given the growth of the video sharing sites. So during this movie, Hellboy does get an official reveal to the world after the fight with the quote-unquote Tooth Fairies that Prince Nuada released to kill the humans. Now, in this movie, Tooth Fairies are not the same as, you leave your tooth under a pillow and they give you $1 or something. They're basically demonic creatures that can eat through human flesh and bone. This then leads to the discovery of a troll market under the Brooklyn Bridge, and this is where the BPRD crosses paths with Princess Nuala. Princess Nuala is there trying to recover the map to the location of the Golden Army. This then leads into the romance subplot between Princess Nuala and Abe Sapien when they go back to the BPRD headquarters. This also leads to Hellboy and Liz's relationship boiling over to a point where both Hellboy and Abe Sapien basically get fucking plastered. Then it leads to a fight between Hellboy and Prince Nuada over the final crown piece. Prince Nuada doesn't find it, but stabs Hellboy with a spear tip that will get closer to his heart if anyone tries to pull it out. Now, the location of the Golden Army is revealed to be in the rolling hills of Ireland. Then a local guide wants that spear tip from Hellboy as payment, but no one can remove it without killing him first. And that's when we get introduced to the Angel of Death, also played by Doug Jones. Now, the Angel of Death temporarily kills Hellboy and tells Liz that it is Hellboy's destiny to bring about the end time / apocalypse for mankind, so Liz is given a choice. Kill Hellboy and save mankind, or save Hellboy and risk the future apocalypse. Liz chooses to save Hellboy and is told that she will suffer the most, and this was going to be the part that was going to lead into Hellboy 3, by the way. This was that big cliffhanger. So Hellboy lives, and it leads to Prince Nuada getting the final piece to the crown to control the Golden Army. It then leads to a conflict where Hellboy, Liz, and Abe Sapien learn that the Golden Army is practically unkillable, and that's when Hellboy challenges Prince Nuada for the crown, and Prince Nuada laughs it off. And it is then later revealed that Hellboy, Anugan Rama, is the son of the Fallen One, so he is royalty, and he has the right to challenge Prince Nuada for the crown. But in short, it leads to a fight where Hellboy comes out victorious, but chooses not to kill Nuada. Nuada then tries to kill Hellboy, but Princess Nuala sacrifices herself via a knife to the heart because Nuada and Nuala can feel the same pain. Hellboy gets the crown, Liz melts it, everyone quits the BPRD, and it's revealed that Liz is carrying twins. End of movie. How was Hellboy 2 The Golden Army received? Hellboy 2 The Golden Army was a hit with the critics and audiences, scoring an 86% critical rating on Rotten Tomatoes out of 248 critic reviews and an audience score of 71% out of 882,317 audience reviews. It has a Metacritic score of 78 based on 36 critic ratings and has an audience rating of 7.5 out of 10 based on 381 user ratings. This movie is sitting at a 7.0 out of 10 on IMDb out of 250,003 reviews on the site. This movie was made on a budget of $85 million back in 2008 and grossed $168,319,243 worldwide back in 2008. So in 2020 dollars, that would equate to $201,788,741.48. Now that we've talked the first two Hellboy movies, let's now discuss the Road to Hellboy 3. Now, there was talk of a sequel almost immediately after Hellboy 2. All Del Toro said back in 2009 is, if they can wait for me to get out of Middle-earth, but we don't know, Ron may want to do it sooner, but I certainly know where we're going with this movie on the third one. Now remember, Del Toro was originally hired to direct those, the Hobbit movies. There was also talk of doing a spin-off movie focusing on Prince Nuada, but that also never came to light because remember, just because a movie gets announced doesn't mean that that the studio's going to follow through with it. Now, in 2010, Del Toro speculated that Hellboy 3 might happen after his next project, but the screenplay hadn't been written yet. Then let's fast forward on July 4th, 2012, after Ron Perlman did a Make-A-Wish function where he appeared in full Hellboy makeup for a terminally ill boy. Del Toro said, "I can publicly state that now we are together trying to do Hellboy 3. So now we move forward to 2013. Mike Mignola did an interview with Comic Book Resources stating that the possibility of a third Hellboy movie is unlikely. Quoting, "The biggest problem I see as far as PR for the next billion years is explaining endlessly that there's no Hellboy 3. And on June 30th, 2013, Del Toro was discussing the possibility of doing Hellboy 3 with Legendary Pictures. At this time, he just did Pacific Rim for them. Ron Perlman even backed the idea of Del Toro doing it with Legendary Pictures, stating that he, Del Toro, loved working with Legendary. Now we fast forward to July 11th, 2014. In a Reddit AMA, Del Toro said, "Well, we don't have that movie on the horizon, but the idea for it was to have Hellboy finally come to terms with the fact that his destiny, his inevitable destiny, is to become the beast of the apocalypse, and having him and Liz face that part of his nature, and he has to do it in order to be able to ironically vanquish the foe that he has to face in the third film. He has to become the beast of the apocalypse to be able to defend humanity, but at the same time, he becomes a much darker being. It's a very interesting ending to the series, but I don't think it will happen. We have gone through basically every studio and asked for financing, and they are not interested. I think that the first movie made its budget back, and a little bit of profit, but then it was very big on video and DVD. The story repeated itself with the second already. It made its money back at the box office, but a small margin of profit in the release of the theatrical print, but was very, very big on DVD and video. Sadly now, from a business point of view, all the studios know is that you don't have the safety net of the DVD and video market, so they view the project as dangerous." In July of 2015, Del Toro said that Legendary Pictures might fund Hellboy 3 if Pacific Rim Uprising does well at the box office. Quoting, "The hard fact is that the movie's going to need about $120 million, and there's nobody knocking down our doors to give it to us. It's a little beyond Kickstarter." And after Del Toro left the director's chair for Pacific Rim Uprising, the deal fell through. In February of 2017, Del Toro announced via Twitter, quote, "Must report that 100% Hellboy 3 will not happen." Now let's fast forward to July of 2019. This would have been just after the reboot came out. Ron Perlman said that he would still love to finish the trilogy with Del Toro, basically ignoring the reboot, and he thought it could happen if the financing could be found. Now let's transition into talking about the reboot, starting with the creative team. Now, this movie was directed by Neil Marshall. This is the same director that brought us movies like The Descent, Doomsday, and Centurion. He would then go into television by directing some episodes of Game of Thrones, Black Sails, Constantine or Constantine, based on where you are in the world. That was the NBC series based on the DC Comics character, Hannibal, and Westworld. Now, the screenplay was written by Andrew Cosby, and his most noteworthy credit as a writer is that he created the series Eureka for Sci-Fi, and reportedly Mike Mignola was heavily involved in the creative process for this movie. Now let's go into talking about the characters of the reboot. So in this one, David Harbour plays Hellboy, and he's not really the same as the Ron Perlman Hellboy. This version of Hellboy is extremely one-dimensional since this isn't Hellboy 3. There's no real love interest. He's just the lone wolf, unlike Ron Perlman's Hellboy that at least had the love interest with Liz Sherman. We then have Ian McShane as Professor Broom, and in this one, he's just kind of a pushover. Hellboy does walk all over him at a couple of times, and he just takes it like a little bitch. Then we have Sasha Lane as Alice Monaghan, who, she was the medium that could communicate to dead people, and she's the person that Hellboy has to protect in this movie. Then we have Daniel Day Kim as Major Ben Damio. He's an MI5 agent that was the lone survivor of a mission that killed his entire squadron somewhere in South America. I can't remember which country. And is later revealed to be a feline creature that he can shapeshift into. This twist really comes out of nowhere because you're led to believe that he was attacked by it in the mission where he was the only survivor. We then have Stephen Graham as Gruagash. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his name. He's a pig creature that wants to get revenge on Hellboy for an earlier deed done to him, so he seeks out the Blood Queen to accomplish that. And speaking of the Blood Queen, we have Mila Jovovich as Nimue / the Blood Queen. Now, she is the primary quote-unquote villain of the movie. She comes off as just extremely comical at times, so she's not really all that threatening to Hellboy. She just wants him to fulfill the prophecy that states that he'll bring about the apocalypse, and really that's about it. So now let's move on to the narrative of the reboot. Now, this movie was based on the Hellboy comic stories of Darkness Calls, The Wild Hunt, The Storm and the Fury, and Hellboy in Mexico. Now, this movie originally started as Hellboy 3. Guillermo del Toro was not offered the writer-director position for this movie, instead being offered like an executive producer credit in name only. He refused. And Ron Perlman was approached to come back as Hellboy, but he declined since Del Toro was not involved in any way, shape, or form. Instead, we got this R-rated reboot of Hellboy. So the story this time revolves around Nimue / the Blood Queen getting resurrected to bring about the end of the world, and she needs to find a husband to be beside her, and this is where Hellboy comes in. Now, personally, I believe that all of the Blood Queen stuff where he also has to find Merlin was left over from that Hellboy 3 script that Mike Mignola and Andrew Cosby wrote originally. So what's taken out of Hellboy 3 that can make this a reboot? Well, it's simple. There's no Liz Sherman or the twins, almost no mention of them, no Abe Sapien, and Professor Broom is brought back to life. Now, this does contain the prophecy that the Angel of Death brought up in Hellboy 2, where it was Hellboy's destiny to bring about the apocalypse. The way that he was going to accomplish that in this movie via the Blood Queen was via the Blood Queen and Excalibur. He can wield Excalibur because we learned from Merlin that Hellboy is the descendant of King Arthur. So that adds depth to Hellboy 2 and how Hellboy was able to challenge Prince Nuada for the crown to control the Golden Army. Now, one last point, this movie brings up its own version of identity politics in the sense that we have a moment when Hellboy is questioning Professor Broom about why he, a monster, is going out and killing other monsters. He's killing his quote-unquote brothers and sisters. In this reboot, Hellboy and Broom really don't have a father-son relationship like they did in the Del Toro movies. In the Del Toro movies, Hellboy had a mutual respect for Broom and not really the BPRD. In this movie, he just treats Broom like crap, and Broom is a pushover who just takes it like a little bitch. And they also introduced Lobster Johnson in a post-credits scene. Now, to me, this suggests that Mike Mignola and Andrew Cosby wanted to build a Hellboy cinematic universe because only the hardcore Hellboy fans are even going to know who Lobster Johnson is. All in all, this movie was a train wreck, and it wants to pass off as a reboot, but there's so much of Hellboy 3 in this movie that the movie feels like it's going through an identity crisis. Is it Hellboy 3 or is it a reboot of the series? Pick one or the other. You can't be both. And speaking of Hellboy 3, why couldn't Mike Mignola and the other producers just get Guillermo del Toro back, especially since he did The Shape of Water back in 2017 and nabbed the Best Director and Best Picture Oscar for that movie at the 90th Academy Awards ceremony in 2018? Just imagine the marketing. The Academy Award-winning director Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman returned to finish their Hellboy trilogy that began back in 2004. Even if they, Mike Mignola, and the producers didn't know that The Shape of Water was going to win Oscars, you could still instead have the Academy Award-nominated director Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman return to finish their Hellboy trilogy that began back in 2004. Talk about the perfect marketing campaign for Hellboy 3, and that would have gotten a lot of people excited like that. How was the reboot of Hellboy received? Well, the reception for this wasn't nearly as good as the first two Del Toro movies. Now, on the Rotten Tomatoes scores 17% from critics out of 208 reviews and has a 49% audience score out of 4,528 reviews. It has a Metacritic score of 31 from critics out of 44 reviews and a user score of 5.5 out of 10 out of 427 reviews. On IMDb, it has a score of 5.2 out of 10 out of 70,229 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $50 million and grossed $44,664,690 worldwide. In 2020 numbers, that only increases to $45,094,116. In short, the critics pretty much trashed the movie and the audience is really split on this entry. Why make a reboot instead of just doing Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy 3? That probably would have made a lot more money at the box office than a reboot. To close this episode out, I do prefer the Guillermo del Toro movies to the 2019 reboot. Like I said with regards to the first movie, the occult is really not my thing, but I still feel that it was a good first outing. And I feel that business acumen post-2010 is just, let's reboot everything that made us money back in the good old days. Instead of just making Hellboy 3, nah, let's just reboot the whole damn thing. This series was going so well after the release of Hellboy 2, and once it was announced that 2019's Hellboy was going to be a reboot, this series was dead in the water immediately after that announcement. And no, David Harbour, it is not the fans' fault that the Hellboy 2019 failed. If you wanted the fans' support, then it was simple. Just make Hellboy 3, not a fucking reboot of the beloved franchise.